Ladies and gentlemen, now we would like to start the panel session 1 discussion titled Global Economic Governance and Digital Economy. My name is Tetsuya Watanabe, Vice President of RIETI, Research Institute of Economy and Trade and Industry. I will be serving as the moderator of this session. So, Wendy, floor is yours.
Well, thank you so much, and it's really my honor to join RIETI and ANU for this incredible symposium. You've really assembled such a great group of panelists in both sets of panels to deal with what I think is one of the most exciting, yet one of the most important issues going forward. And Watanabe-san, I recall our days working on TPP together, and so I have very fond memories. And we can get in another conversation about whether the US will rejoin TPP, but that's not the subject for tonight's panel. So I thought I would then start with kind of my thoughts on this idea of the need for multilateral digital rules. And I think, as this panel probably will conclude, there is a need for multilateral digital rules. Number one, such rules could help spread the benefits of the digital economy, not only to our companies, but to our citizens and workers and small and medium-sized enterprises. And I stress this because during the Biden administration, I think it's going to be critical to show that any potential trade agreements benefit the citizens, not only of the United States, but all over the world, as opposed to just benefiting large corporations. Second, I believe that multilateral digital rules are needed to promote coherence and avoid fragmentation. Next slide. Next slide. And third, multilateral digital rules could help avoid disputes between countries. And we're already seeing some disputes, the most notable being in the digital services tax area. But also, if you recall, the outgoing Trump administration was also complaining about localization policies in countries like Indonesia, India, and elsewhere. So rules, I think, could help avoid disputes. And finally, I think rules, and here this last point is really made as a former trade negotiator, and that is it's easier to establish multilateral rules in areas where regulations aren't really embedded and set in stone. And so I think we still have more time here, but the more time that is wasted, I think what will happen is countries are going to feel very protective over their rules and will be less willing to agree to multilateral rules. Next screen. So where are we? And here I would just say, and I'm not going to get into any detail here, but to give you an idea, there's so many international organizations and trade groupings getting into this game of trying to set multilateral trade rules. The G20 has been quite active, starting with Japan in 2019 when they were chair of the G20, talking about data free flow with trust. And this concept has lived on past Japan's chairmanship of the G20. The G7 is very active on this front too. And I think in the lead up to the June meeting chaired by the UK, this is going to be an increasing area of focus. The WTO e-commerce negotiations now have 86 participants trying to work on rules that they all can agree on for e-commerce. The OECD has done a lot of good work in this area. They're leading the negotiations on the digital services tax. But they're also doing a lot of good work on the issue of making government data accessible and available to the public. And APEC has played an instrumental role going back to the days when I was in the government working on these issues. And I know in our next panel, particularly with the executive director of APEC, my good friend Rebecca, we'll hear more about all the incredible work APEC's doing in this space. And there's also many bilateral and regional trade agreements that either are focused exclusively on digital trade or have this aspect of trade as one of their chapters in their free trade agreements. And here I would just note that the CPTPP and RCEP have chapters on e-commerce. The US has a bilateral agreement with Japan, as well as an ambitious chapter in the USMCA on these issues. Singapore has a bilateral in effect with Australia in this area and is now negotiating with Korea. And then there's the DEPA, the DEPA, the Digital Economy Partnership Agreement between New Zealand, Singapore, and Chile, which now, I think just this morning, Canada has said they're going to start kind of the public process in Ottawa to get stakeholder input on the prospects of Canada joining this agreement. So my point here, there's a lot going on in this space, but there's no clear leader. Next slide. But even though people recognize that, you know, there's a need for multilateral rules in this area, there are really serious and what I would even call sobering challenges. And I don't mean to be pessimistic because I'm someone who likes to see the glass half full. And here at the core, I think there's just a fundamental difference in philosophies and values with respect to the internet and data, which is resulting in multiple regulatory frameworks. We've also seen the emergence of what some are calling digital protectionism, or you can just call digital, they're just restrictions, but they're on the rise as countries try to figure out how they can promote their own companies in this space and how they can ensure that they get part of the revenues that other companies are making in this space. There's also an uptick in decoupling policies. And while many people attribute this to the United States, I also think China has been on the forefront of signaling decoupling from the rest of the world and the United States in this area as they pursue their indigenous innovation policies. There's geopolitical factors, particularly the US-China dispute. And I would also just, you know, a challenge that we all face, that our governments are not really organized on digital trade. In many countries, there's no minister of digital trade. And so when you try and establish rules in this area, you don't really know who to talk to, and you're assembling a lot of different ministers who have different responsibilities in this area. And I think that is a big challenge that needs to be grappled with. And finally, there's no single international organization that naturally would fit to lead the work in this area. Next slide. So where is the Biden administration on all of this? I mean, they're in their early days. It's about day 60, and they're confronting a lot of domestic issues now. But they've been different. The president and certain cabinet officials have been vocal in this area. And in this slide, I just contain, I lift 3 quotes, one from the president when he was in Munich recently, or virtually, for the Munich Security Conference, a quote from Secretary Blinken, and a quote from the new USTR, Catherine Tai. Next slide. And in these quotes, what can we take away from them? And here I would just emphasize a few points. Next slide. There's really an emphasis on democratic respect to digital trade, and that includes transparency, fairness. The US clearly is looking to play a leadership role in developing rules with allies and partners. The US is prepared to respond to unfair digital restrictions, clearly sending signals with respect to the digital services tax that they rather see a negotiated settlement than go ahead with the Trump Section 301 investigations that they inherited, that the issues that are part of the digital debate are also going to fall under the broader China review that the Biden administration is undertaking. And finally, and I'll get into this in the next slide, the rules that are developed in this area are going to need to work for the US middle class and workers. There's going to be a real focus on narrowing the digital divide and ensuring that all citizens benefit from this digital economy. The Biden administration, and Catherine Tai in particular, has been very vocal about a need to reset our trade policy and establish a worker-centric trade policy. And over time, we'll see what this means in concrete terms. But I think it's going to be increasingly important as countries grapple with how to address multilateral rules in the digital space, to demonstrate how these rules will benefit workers and the middle class, not only in the United States, but around the world, how such rules will promote equity and inclusion, how such rules will promote SME participation. And here I know this is a key issue, particularly for ASEAN countries, but also for other countries in Asia. How these rules will narrow the digital divide. I mean, COVID in a number of ways has brought digital tools to the forefront, but we've also seen that certain workers in our countries and students in our countries have not had the same access to digital tools to allow them to really participate in this world. And finally, how these rules will promote consumer interests. So again, I think it's critical, and as we talk about these issues going forward, that we take kind of a worker-centric, kind of citizen-centric view on the rules. And finally, if I can conclude with my next slide, what does this all mean as we look ahead? And I know part of this symposium is to get experts together and talk about how we can shape multilateral rules that might work for everyone. Clearly, there are serious challenges and we need to be very realistic going forward. So I wanted to just put forward some ideas that maybe we can discuss tonight. Number one is, instead of automatically thinking about binding rules in this area, should we be thinking about principles and principles we can agree on that would govern the digital economy, such as inclusiveness, openness, transparency, interoperability, and non-discrimination, and others. Second, instead of dealing with the really sensitive, tough issues first, as a trade negotiator, I always learned maybe try and start with some easier, low-hanging fruit, what we call confidence building measures, and then over time, build on that foundation, trying to tackle the more difficult issues. Third, and here I want to just point to the digital economy agreement that was reached between New Zealand, Singapore, and Chile. That is, they agreed on a module approach, which means that although the agreement covers lots of areas, they've given the option to countries who want to join to just sign on to certain modules in the immediate term, and then over time sign on to additional modules. And I think this is a really interesting way to think about the digital space. And maybe this does provide a useful approach for going forward. And then getting back to a comment I made in the beginning, noting that how many international groupings and organizations have a kind of say and influence and a work program in this area. Do we need to consider establishing a new international organization just dealing with issues of the digital economy? If they're going to become more and more important, do we need to have a separate organization? And finally, here, how should governments organize themselves, particularly governments that don't have a Ministry of Digital Economy? For example, should governments appoint a national digital Sherpa, and then all these Sherpas can meet on these issues? So I wanted to put forward these ideas as kind of what I would call food for thought for going forward, particularly as this symposium is focused on trying to develop multilateral rules and norms for moving forward in this incredibly important area. Thank you very much.